More Russian sanctions, a price cap on gas to deal with high inflation and energy prices, all ahead of this winter season. I'm joined by Vice President of the European Commission and EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis. Welcome to the Global Conversation, Commissioner.
Good afternoon.
Well, the EU's announced this week, alongside the G7, a global price cap for Russian oil. But there are worries that this will trigger a rise in oil prices and even more instability. Are you confident that this will have the desired effect to impact on Russian revenue?
So, in a sense, with this price cap, if it's implemented at least the G7, but possibly also broader level, on one hand, we would deprive Russia of additional revenues, which it could use to further finance its war against Ukraine. On another hand, it also helps to stabilize the overall oil prices.
But I think there's a concern, obviously, that not everybody is on board outside the G7 and the EU. For example, India, China, other countries that will perhaps avail of Russian oil and pay the higher price.
In this case, we know that already now Russia is selling its gas, to China, to India, with a significant discount to compare with the world prices. Probably they will have to sell it even deeper discount and also will not get so much revenue. So the aim to reduce Russia's ability to finance its war machine is indeed helped by this imposition of the price cap.
So essentially it's influential regardless. Will there be a price cap on Russian gas coming into the EU? I mean, we talked about oil there, but the gas?
Indeed, as you know, it's something which is very much discussed, and from European Commission side we also have prepared different ways how this price cap can actually be implemented. So the discussions on this issue are indeed ongoing. Probably two things to note. One, that the volumes of Russian gas coming to the EU are anyway rapidly declining, and by now, for example, Norway is the biggest gas supplier to the EU, not Russia. And second, when we are discussing this price cap, it's also important that we treat reliable partners differently from Russia. So, for example, Norway has been doing a lot to increase its gas supplies to the EU at the time when we really needed it.
So I suppose moving away from sanctions and onto how the EU can act to deal with the energy crisis, we heard from President von der Leyen saying there will be a price cap on gas, likely to be a cap on the trade of gas within Europe. Can you just explain to us how this will work and how it will affect the price of gas? What can be done for consumers?
There is one discussion on so-called dynamic price cap, which would follow the world gas prices with certain, so to say, premium on top of those world gas prices to ensure that there is gas availability to the EU.
And how far along are the negotiations with the reliable partners like Norway on potentially creating some sort of lower price for gas?
Of course, we hope to finalize them as soon as possible, but since those are negotiations, we cannot now set the deadline because it also requires for another side to agree. But of course, we are keeping in mind that it needs to be done in a very short time frame because we are addressing the crisis situation.
Well, I suppose moving on to how EU member states have dealt with it, I mean, how concerned are you about the German decision to unilaterally announce €200 billion energy plan? Do you think that's a breach of fair competition, but I suppose moreover a breach of the solidarity and unity we've seen amongst member states so far?
As regards Germany's announced measures, indeed, we had some discussion on Germany's, also other countries' measures yesterday in ECOFIN. So the German Finance Minister Lindner presented the package, also outlines that the support is meant to be there over several years, so it's not all to be used now. And many of the measures are still in a process of, so to say, preparation, so it's still a bit open how exactly they are going to be implemented.
We saw the intervention by Commissioners Breton and Gentiloni yesterday. Is there something of a split within the Commission? I mean, they're calling for more solidarity than you have, I suppose, in contrast, Germany's position.
Well, first of all, there are a number of solidarity mechanisms which are already available. To give some example, we still have unused 225 billion euros from the Recovery and Resilience Facility loans. And actually, just yesterday, in ECOFIN, finance ministers agreed on their position concerning so-called Repower EU proposal, which on one hand would accelerate the use of those 225 billion and puts also additional 20 billion in grants on the table to address current energy challenges.
You also said this week that we can no longer exclude a contraction of economic growth, and we've heard similar from the ECB that essentially a recession is on the way. Is that the most likely scenario?
So what we are seeing actually is that this year, the first half of the year was actually quite strong. And if anything, we probably will be revising upwards this year's growth forecast, so from 2.7%, which is the current forecast, upwards. But also, we are seeing right now a rapidly deteriorating environment with confidence indicators going rapidly down. So I would say the economic outlooks depends also to large extent how we will manage current energy crisis. So if we manage to ensure sufficient energy supplies, we can avoid this scenario. So a lot will depend on how we will be managing the energy crisis.
Just before I let you go, Vice President, given what we've just spoken about there, high inflation, concerns around energy, more sanctions against Russia, how can the EU ensure that citizens are behind them?
Well, first of all, indeed, what we are now dealing are the consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and decisions which Russia is taking. So the best way to mitigate the consequences of the war is to stop the war, because the faster we can stop the war, the faster we can start recovering from the economic consequences of the war. And from this point of view, it's very important that we continue to provide support to Ukraine, military support, financial support, following the Putin's last steps in escalating the war.
Okay, well, Vice President of the European Commission and EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, thank you very much for joining us on the Global Conversation.
Thank you.